All right, everybody. So we were chattering away about plumbing and all this other stuff, but I have some announcements, which I will tell afterwards because there's the plumber. All right.
Good timing. So hopefully she set me up to be able to take over here. And right now you're looking at nothing, but in a moment you're going to see something. So I won't be able to man the chat window while I do this. So hopefully this works out okay. So our last lecture, I ended on Benjamin West and his information and his painting that we're studying. And just to remind you, remember that Benjamin West, huge history painter, went over to London and really became known as a great history painter. And even though he's American, he never came back after he moved to London. And he's the one that did Penn's Treaty with the Indians. And we also talked last time about his earlier work, The Death of General Wolfe. We talked about history painting in general and its importance in art history. So we ended with that, and now we're in the next section. And before we get into Paul Revere, who was the subject of John Singleton Copley painting, one of the first things we did, but now we're looking at Paul Revere's work as an artist. But first we're going to talk about prints. We're not talking Prince, Purple Rain Prince, I could do air guitar here. It's prints that you make by looking at a drawing or a painting and making an engraving based on a drawing or painting, and then making prints of that engraving. And why was this so important contextually, historically? It wasn't history painting that changed people's perceptions of the world. History painting was the highest level of artistic thought, but it was prints, cheap, mass-produced prints, cartoons, also known as broadsides. That's what inflamed the masses and helped spark the insurrection that led to what we call the American Revolution. Mass circulation, shaping public opinion about the cause, and helped make general populace more aware of political debates and controversies. So how do they get this out into the masses? Well, if you've got a drawing or an artwork, somebody has to make a copy of that. And what happens is you have a metal plate, usually either copper or zinc, and then you take, these are different sized burins. Engravings are produced by using a burin to cut into the surface of the metal plate. And then you've got ink that you smear into that. And we've seen this website before, but it bears re-going over just to get it in your heads. This is a great part of the Metropolitan Museum in New York. Really nice little site on engraving process. Engraving is a subset of what's called intaglio, printmaking process. Engravings and etchings are intaglio. This means lines are cut into a metal plate, just like he's doing here. Here he's using the burin, cutting, scratching, digging lines into a metal plate, usually copper or zinc. First, they polish the metal plate, remove all scratches and imperfections, so just the intentional lines will eventually be printed. The printmaker incises or cuts a composition directly into the surface of a metal plate using a sharp tool known as a burin. It's a steel shaft ending in a beveled diamond-shaped tip that is set into a rounded wooden handle. Different sizes of burins can affect the size of the lines and how much pressure the printmaker applies to the burin can be used to create thinner or thicker grooves in the plate. Creating smooth lines requires both strength and control on the part of the printmaker. You can't make a mistake. There's no correcting the mistake that you make. You'd have to start all over. The metal plate is placed on a sandbag or a pillow. That's this white baggy thing underneath to help manipulate and move the plate, especially when a composition requires curved lines. See how the kind of smushes in as he's curving it, or she's curving it? Looks more like a female hand. I could be wrong. To enhance a purely linear composition with tone, the printmaker applies a system of hatching. Lines, dots, and dashes, sometimes cross-hatching, among other kinds of markings placed close together to create dense areas in the print that hold more ink. The closer the marks are together, the darker those areas will appear. But you really have to make certain that you don't cross over. You can't make the markings too closely together, or the ink would bleed from one line into another. Then it gets inked. So see, somebody's made, they inked it, and then they rub it all into it, rub it all off so it's not on any of the undug part of it. Very interesting. A cloth ball, cardboard tab, or equivalent material is used to gently spread ink across the whole face of the plate. The same material is used to remove most of the excess ink from the surface. The plate is further cleaned using a tarlatan rag, which is a heavily starched cheesecloth. After the plate is wiped to the desired level, it's ready for printing. While some early intaglio prints appear to have been produced by simply pressing the paper against the plate by hand, in most cases, the pressure required to force the paper into the finely cut lines entailed the use of a special press equipped with rollers. You can see the rollers here. The plate is placed on a bed of the press with the ink side up, sheet of dampened paper placed on top, and before the plate and sheet are moved through the press together, they're covered with printing blankets, often made of felt, to soften the pressure on the metal plate. And then you get your final image. The pressure of the press not only forces the ink into the damp paper, but also produces an outline of the outer edges of the metal plate in the paper, known as a plate mark. So nice little review of engravings, which is important because this goes to the heart of making mass-produced prints. A printer could produce many copies from a single plate, selling to a large number of people. Artists often used humor to make their points. This is where the first cartoons come from, combining words and images. Sold on the street or from bookstores or print shops, can also be purchased through subscriptions. So, Boston, evening of March 5th, 1770. Remember, at the time, there are 15,000 inhabitants in the city of Boston, 4,000 British troops stationed in the city. That's a fairly large percentage of troops compared to inhabitants. Boston is the most unruly of the colonial cities. So an unruly mob of laborers, apprentices, and merchant sailors start throwing snowballs and rocks at the soldiers. We've actually got a more in-depth description of this in one of the links. Initiating the confrontation. Someone fires a shot. One site thinks that one of the soldiers fell down and his gun went off accidentally. We don't really know. Someone fires a shot, causing several soldiers to begin firing upon the crowd. Like they heard a shot, they're supposed to start shooting. 5 men are killed, including Crispus Attucks, a dock worker of African and Native American descent. He was either a free man or an escaped slave from Framingham, Massachusetts. We don't really know. He's credited with being the first casualty of the American Revolution. Some Bostonians, in fact, many Bostonians, but I'm going directly word for word from the packet. Some Bostonians were sympathetic to the soldiers. Many of the mob were Irish Catholic or Black, and there was much discrimination against Irish Catholics and Blacks. So many of the people being killed, in fact, later on we'll talk about Crispus Attucks. In some versions of this, there's a Black man representing Crispus Attucks as one of the fallen colonials. And in other copies, he's not Black. So it depends on whether they want to accentuate that or not. So I have a lot of different, now, by the way, this here, which is a copy directly out of your art resource guide, this is Henry Pelham's broadside titled The Fruits of Arbitrary Power, or The Bloody Massacre, which was copied without Pelham's permission by Paul Revere. And we're gonna compare side by side Paul Revere's version and Pelham's version. And knowing that Pelham did it first, you'll be able to clearly see where Revere did massive plagiarizing. So see what if I got a couple of links here, some good stuff. There we go.
Friends would walk up to me and just be
we
like,
don't
what the
want
fuck
that.
is in your mug?
What?
And I would just tell them,
I hate ads on YouTube. Here
Hello
we go.
everyone. Today we're looking at a super famous primary source which has been used a lot on AP test, and that is Paul Revere's engraving, which depicts, with a bias, the Boston Massacre that occurred in March of 1770. We're going to briefly discuss the historical context, the Boston Massacre itself, and Revere's depiction of it. But possibly more importantly, we are going to discuss how this is a piece of political propaganda and what type of effect it has on the revolutionary time period. Okay, let's get into it. First, the historical context. The French and Indian.
I know that Mrs. Scully has gone over this in history, but I think it's a really important point to make for those people who haven't taken decathlon exams before. There's going to be a lot of crossover between history and art and music and lit, because everything, it's not compartmentalized. So there are a lot of history questions that will be on the art test because there's just this overlap. And so it's good to constantly re-go over things. So there's a little copying previous information, but it's important to remember what led up to the Boston Massacre.
War ended in 1763. The British had spent an enormous sum in that war to fight and defeat the French and their Indian allies in North America. Prior to the French and Indian War, the British North American colonies enjoyed what is termed as a policy of salutary neglect by the British government, which meant that the colonies could by and large govern themselves, and various taxes and restrictions were only lightly enforced. That came to a crashing halt with the French and Indian War, as the British became much more hands-on with their colonies. They passed acts like the Quartering, Declaratory, and Stamp Act in the mid-1760s. These were unpopular in the colonies, who were successful in getting one of the acts repealed after some protests and boycotts. However, a new series of acts were passed in the 1767 and 1768 called the Townshend Acts. These were a series of acts, some of which resulted in tariffs on common items like paper and tea. And additionally, these acts empowered British officials to force more compliance of the taxes on colonists. Some colonists, especially those in port towns that were in the merchant industry, objected to the Townshend Acts. Their main arguments were that they were against their colonial charters. They were against natural laws, which signals back to the popular Enlightenment ideas of the time and John Locke's philosophy, and they went against their constitutional rights as British subjects. In 1770, at the Boston's Customs House, a disagreement between a merchant and customs official turned violent, which then drew a large crowd of a few hundred Bostonians that shouted, spit, and taunted the British officials at the Customs House. A few British reinforcements came, and the situation became extremely tense. After one British soldier was struck by an object, he fired his gun, and then the others did as well. When the dust cleared, several colonists were injured or dead. After the incident, the governor of Massachusetts immediately ordered an investigation. What also ensued was a battle in the media, with patriots showing the incident as British barbarity, while loyalist media largely blamed the mob. This is where the patriot Paul Revere steps in to create his influential engraving of the incident. Okay, now let's analyze and source the engraving. The first thing we need to look at is the creator, Paul Revere, who was a prominent Boston businessman, and one of his main trades was as a silversmith. His businesses had been negatively affected by the British tariffs, starting with the Stamp Act, and during the time of the engraving, the Townshend Acts. He was also a patriot and member of the Sons of Liberty, which is very important for students to know so you can identify his point of view. Next, when it comes to the engraving itself, it is an example of political propaganda. Revere was not concerned with creating an accurate depiction of the event. He wanted to show the British in the worst possible light, so his engraving depicts the British as the aggressors. And there were several other key aspects in the engraving that is supposed to invoke sympathy for the colonists and hatred toward the British, like the woman in the back and the dog in the foreground. One of the most obvious examples is a sign above the officers saying Butcher's Hall, which, as you can guess, is saying the British are butchering these innocent colonists. He even draws the soldiers with grins like they are enjoying it. And finally, Revere titles the piece The Bloody Massacre in King Street. One thing to think about is how a loyalist might portray the incident. I'm sure it would have a different title for starters, maybe something along the lines of A Drunken Mob on King Street. Okay, so we know this engraving was intended to rile up resentment against the British, and it was very effective in doing so. The engraving will be published in newspapers and will have a long legacy. Speaking of which, let's take a look at the rest of the story. So the British soldiers involved in the Boston Massacre were put on trial, and they had an unlikely lawyer. Yes, John Adams, who at the time was a patriot. So why did he defend them? Well, Adams was definitely a principled man, and felt the soldiers should get a fair trial, and other lawyers were willing to take up their case. He did a great job, and once the evidence was laid out, the jury acquitted the soldiers of most charges, with the exception of manslaughter for 2 of the soldiers, who received a reduced sentence of a branding on their thumbs. Overall, the Boston Massacre is considered a major event in the Revolutionary time period. However, keep in mind this occurred in 1770. Lexington and Concord are still 5 years away, and the Declaration of Independence is 6 years, so this does not immediately lead to the Revolutionary War. Paul Revere's engraving would become a very effective piece of propaganda that would continue to be used in the following years, as the event was commemorated by groups like the Sons of Liberty every year, and millions of U.S. history and AP U.S. history students have listened to their teachers discuss the event in Revere's engraving, helping to make sure this piece of history lives on. Okay, that does it for this primary source. Please subscribe and share the channel with your fellow classmates and teachers. This year, many schools are going to hybrid or distance learning, so these videos may come as great use to them.
There we go. So I like that video. Some Bostonians were sympathetic to the soldiers. And we don't need a bra commercial. I've got to try to, I don't know how to get commercials out of my YouTube videos. Subject matter and visual analysis of the Boston Massacre, 1770, Paul Revere. British redcoats stand in front of the customs house, and we'll look at a blown up picture of this, but it says Butcher's Hall here, and then here it says Customs House. And I'll get there's another link. It's either this one or the next one, but I wanted to get these specific things that the Art Resource Guide calls attention to. British redcoats stand in front of the Customs House in a unified diagonal row with left leg extended forward. So each one of them, it's the left leg. Muskets aggressively pointed at the unarmed crowd. Faces are angular with severe expressions. They look mean. Well, this guy looks joyful, and we'll zoom in on different ones. Sign up here says Butcher's Hall. This sign does not exist in the real location, never did. The implication that the redcoats are butchers. The Americans, colonists on the left, appear as victims. They're softer, more individualized facial expressions. 3 bleeding bodies sprawled on the ground. See the blood. Actually, I see blood streaming from 4 locations. Maybe this is 2 different areas on the same person. 2 other figures bleeding and being carried. One of them's bleeding, being carried. There we go. Woman in blue, right here, clasps hands and looks concerned. It's a really, really dark blue. Reference to the Virgin Mary in Renaissance crucifix scenes. So this right here is a Virgin Mary reference. Historically, no matter what source you read, it was the unruly mob that initiated the confrontation. Not only that, there were well over 100, if not 200, of the mob and a handful of British soldiers. You can see how Paul Revere really politicized this here, made the number of the unruly crowd much smaller, doesn't show them throwing rocks and stones and snowballs and things like that at the British soldiers. This is very politicized. In the background, smoke fills the air, fills the square behind the action. Blue sky, although the actual event took place at night. Several prominent Boston landmarks, the Old State House, also known as the Town House, and the steeple of the First Church. There's also a moon that we'll talk about in a little bit. Some of the numbers here, you can see where they got them from. On the evening of March 5th, crowds of day laborers, apprentices, and merchant sailors began to pelt British soldiers with snowballs and rocks. One source that I read, not this one, says that one person came out, was highly drunk, and got into an altercation with the one soldier who was there, and then more of the colonists started coming out of the bar. So they'd been drinking. Produced just 3 weeks after the Boston Massacre, Paul Revere's historic engraving, The Bloody Massacre in King Street, probably the most effective piece of war propaganda in American history. Not an accurate depiction of the actual event, and we've read about the others. Revere based his engraving on that of artist Henry Pelham, which we'll get into more of this later, who created the first illustration of the episode. Henry was never paid nor credited for his work. Some things to remember: what Paul Revere used in his engraving to shape public opinion. The British are lined up. An officer is giving an order to fire. That would be this one right here, implying the British soldiers are the aggressors. Colonists are shown reacting to the British when in fact they had attacked the soldiers. British faces are sharp and angular. In contrast, the Americans' softer, more innocent features. The colonists, who are mostly laborers, are dressed as gentlemen. Elevating their status could affect the way people perceive them. The only two signs in the image that you can read are Butcher's Hall and Customs House, both hanging directly over the British soldiers. Butcher's Hall, Customs House right in here. I had to. Never mind. Anyway, let's see. There is a distressed woman in the rear of the crowd. This played on 18th century notions of chivalry. There appears to be a sniper in the window beneath the Butcher's Hall sign. I've got another site that will show this, but you can't see it in this version. We're going to take a closer look at that. The art resource guide does not mention this. Dogs tend to symbolize loyalty and fidelity. The dog in the print is not bothered by the mayhem behind him and is staring out at the viewer. Now, if any of you have dogs, my dog pretty much really was scared 4th of July and the day before when people are doing fireworks outside in the cul-de-sac. And I really find it hard to believe this dog would just be standing there amidst all this chaos. The sky is illustrated in such a way that it seems to cast light on the British atrocity. It's shining, it's kind of coming down at an angle, shining light on the atrocious acts. Crispus Attucks is visible in the lower left-hand corner. In many other existing copies of this print, he is not portrayed as African American. It depends on the point the people are trying to make later on. The weather conditions depicted do not match the testimony presented at the soldier's trial. There was no snow. Very interesting. The soldier's stance indicates an aggressive military posture. In the first edition, the time on the clock was incorrect. Revere had it corrected immediately. The trial of the British soldiers was the first time a judge used the phrase reasonable doubt, which I found very interesting. One of the British soldiers named Pierce Butler left the army and became a South Carolina plantation owner. In 1787, he was appointed as a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. So one of the actual British soldiers winds up being a delegate. This is the neatest thing of all, going through this. You start exploring here. By the beginning, 1770, 4,000 British soldiers, 15,000 inhabitants. On the evening of March 5th, crowds of day laborers, apprentices, and merchant sailors began to pelt British soldiers with snowballs and rocks. Produced just 3 weeks after the Boston Massacre, Paul Revere's historic engraving, The Bloody Massacre, perpetrated in King Street, probably the most effective piece of war propaganda in American history. Here's where you can see Butcher's Hall and Customs House. And here's the soldier, the British soldier, giving the order to fire. And if you look right here, here is a sniper shooting a gun outside the window. The depiction of the colonists by Revere is central to the powerful propaganda message. In the image, the colonists are shown reacting to the British when in fact they attack the soldiers. The colonists, who are mostly laborers, are dressed as gentlemen, giving them elevated status in 18th century society. Oh, they're firing on gentlemen. They were drunk day laborers. Not that it's okay to shoot day laborers, but they were trying to get the higher society in sense, because they're the ones with the money and can help support the war effort. And here's Crispus Attucks. In some versions, he's not black. Here's the British soldier that looks like he's enjoying himself. Revere included the colonists' grievances subtly in the etching. The only two legible signs, Butcher's Hall, Customs House, customs taxes, serve to remind the viewer of the cause of the conflict. In case you don't understand what customs taxes, this is where you have to pay money to import things, customs taxes. So custom hall, that's customs house. That would immediately, everybody's thinking taxes. Note, there's also appears to be a sneaky sniper in the window beneath the Butcher's Hall sign. The art resource guide does not mention this at all. Here's the distressed woman. Who but the British would attack a crowd, including a woman? How dare they? And there's the dog, looking totally unconcerned, staring out at the viewer. And Crispus Attucks. In many other existing copies of the print, he is not portrayed as African American. Based on all the research I did, it looks like there were probably around 200 prints made of Revere's work. Not that many still in existence, but 200 total made. Can't remember that Pelham doesn't bring that up. There is a written underneath the caption of the broadside. This is by Revere. Unhappy Boston, see thy sons deplore thy hallowed walks besmeared with guiltless gore, while Faithless and his savage bands with murderous rancor stretch their bloody hands like fierce barbarians grinning over their prey. Approve the carnage and enjoy the day. If scalding drops from rage, from anguish wrung, if speechless sorrow laboring for a tongue, or if a weeping world can aught appease the plaintive ghosts of victims such as these, the patriots' copious tears for each are shed, a glorious tribute which embalms the dead. Faithless, there was a Unhappy Boston, the Halliburton's, no, they don't mention, they only mention a few of the lines in the art resource guide on page 74. So we've gone through more here than they actually list. The sky is illustrated in such a way that it seems to cast light on the British atrocity. It's dark and foreboding over the British, while the sunlight shines on the colonists. As for the image's use as a news report, the weather conditions depicted do not match the testimony presented at the soldiers' trial. And here's the aforementioned clock that originally was incorrect. Henry Pelham's version, and we're going to have them side by side in another slide. Henry Pelham and Paul Revere had been friends. They did not part that way. Evidently, Pelham showed Revere his depiction of the street battle, and Revere then designed and printed his widely circulated version before Pelham's went to press. In a letter dated March 29th, 1770, Pelham, he actually wrote more than this. The full letter's on another slide, but when I heard that you were cutting a plate of the late murder, I thought it impossible, as I knew you was not capable of doing it unless you copied it from mine, and as I thought I had entrusted it in the hands of a person who had more regard to the dictates of honor and justice than to take the undue advantage you have done of the confidence and trust I reposed in you. And then there's more, and we have more, and we're doing okay with time. Just wanted to set the stage here. Many of these prints are hand colored, and each one is slightly different coloring. Paul Revere copied, printed, and published a design by Henry Pelham in 1770. Remember, Henry Pelham is John Singleton Copley's stepbrother and the subject of Boy with a Squirrel. Remember, Copley, self-taught, his stepfather, Henry Pelham's father, okay, had an art studio, which Copley took over when his stepfather died. And remember, he was age 13. He took over, became a very famous portraitist. One of his first major paintings, which he sent to London, was Boy with a Squirrel. Boy with a Squirrel was his stepbrother, Henry, who was several years younger at the time. Well, always several years younger. So Henry is the one who made the original design of this Boston Massacre. Remember that Copley painted Paul Revere's painting, one of the first artworks that we studied this year. He painted his portrait in 1768. Copley, meaning John Singleton, also purchased jewelry and silver cases and frames for his miniature portraits from Revere for over a decade. Remember, Revere was a silversmith, so he made silver frames and jewelry and things like that. Henry Pelham was 22 when the massacre took place just blocks from his home on Congress Street. Put an asterisk here. Originally, it was called Linham's Way, but it's now known as Congress Street. Pelham lent Revere his engraving for use as a reference. Revere copied it directly and started selling his version on March 26, 1770. Revere did not credit Pelham or compensate him. Revere did make a few additions. He's the one who added Butcher's Hall and Customs House. He also added a sniper, the blue sky, the crescent moon, and the snow. Also captioned underneath the print with 18 lines of verse, which begins, and this is what's the only part of the 18 lines of verse, which is repeated in the art resource guide. Unhappy Boston, see thy sons deplore, thy hallowed walks be smeared with guiltless gore. He also lists the names of the people who died. Unhappy sufferers is what he called them. Samuel Gray, Samuel Maverick, James Caldwell, Crispus Attucks, and Patrick Carr. They were all killed. 6 were wounded. 2 of them, Christopher Monk and John Clark, were mortally. Now, I've looked this up, and depending on, because the previous 5 were killed, 6 wounded, 2 mortally wounded. Well, if you're mortally wounded, doesn't that mean you're killed? I have a hard time with this. I'm still going down the rabbit hole of what does specifically mortally wounded differ from killed. Here are the 2 copies side by side. Here's Henry Pelham's print. Here's Paul Revere's print. Can you say plagiarism? It's just now.
Oh my God, you turn that into turnitin.com and it's like a 97%.
Right. I mean, he added Butcher's Hall, he added the sniper. Okay, he added the sniper. But I mean, even the way that the bodies are positioned on the ground, the dog, I mean, he added the coloring. This is much more colorful. If you look at the faces of the British soldiers, he made them look more menacing. But it's virtually the same. Oh, look, he added a crescent moon, right? That's like the only original. Even this little puff of smoke looks identical to the puff of smoke in the other figure. He enlarged the clock, which is probably why the original enlargement had the wrong time. There's this steeple in the background of Henry's, and it doesn't have one here. So he actually took that away. This puffy cloud, he clearly added a lot of color. He made it deeper red, the blues. Notice
Legitimately, I like Henry Pelham's better. I'm so sorry. I think I missed the sniper. Can you point out
right here, little sniper. It's behind the grassy knoll. I mean, in the library. No, it's the customs house, right? This is Boston, not Dallas. Yeah. So it's he added a lot of blood and gore. Notice that Crispus Attucks is not an African American here or here, but in other versions of Paul Revere's print, this character has a blackened face. So very, very interesting. Pelham's version never stuck. He tried to sell his version a week after Revere, but Revere's version already dominated the market. You get out there first, there you go. Pelham wrote Revere a very angry letter accusing him of the most dishonorable action you could well be guilty of, claiming it was as if you had plundered me on the highway. Highway robber. England did establish copyright laws to protect publishers as early as 1735, but the law wasn't strongly enforced in the 18th century and certainly not as strongly enforced in the American colonies. What do we call that? A salutary, there's the word for it. It was brought up in the video that I showed. They had these laws on the books, but in the colonies, they weren't strictly enforced. And when England started strictly enforcing laws that were on the books, that pissed us off. Of course, this was 1770. 3 years later, 1773, Paul Revere and 116 of the Sons of Liberty and some others, they have the Boston Tea Party throwing Copley's father-in-law's tea into the harbor. So we have this complete mixture. Here's Paul Revere, his painting done by Copley. Here's Copley's half-brother, Henry, who did this original sketch of the Boston Massacre. Revere plagiarized it. 3 years later, he throws his father-in-law's tea into the drink. I mean, what connections here? By the way, the Art Resource Guide does not mention this. Copley's home later on, 1770, late 73, 74, is surrounded by patriots at one point, and he's very scared for his life and his family. That's what helped push him over the edge. Finally follows Benjamin West's advice and does what Benjamin West did, goes to London, never to come back to the colonies. Henry follows him a few years later. If you want to, there's another link here with the angry letter. Paul Revere, plagiarizing patriot. A lot of alliteration here. Yeah, here's the cute little antique show. I thought this was, we got time. Here's one more video, but first here's the entire letter from Henry. When I heard you were cutting a plate for the late murder, I thought it impossible, as I knew you was not capable of doing it unless you copied it from mine. And as I thought I had entrusted it in the hands of a person who had more regard to the dictates of honor and justice than to take the undue advantage you have done of the confidence and trust I reposed in you. But I find I was mistaken. And after being at the great trouble and expense of making a design, paying to Henry Pelham had already paid for paper, he made the design, the printing, and he finds himself behind the eight ball, so to speak. Find myself the most ungenerous manner deprived, not only of any proposed advantage, but even of the expense I have been at, as truly as if you had plundered me on the highway. If you are insensible of the dishonor you have brought on yourself by this act, the world will not be so. However, I leave you to reflect upon and consider of one of the most dishonorable actions you could well be guilty of. But I love this P.S. P.S. I send by the bearer the prints I borrowed of you. My mother desired you would send the hinges and part of the press that you had from her. So they'd obviously done a lot of things together in the past, but never again. And this is a cute little video, so we'll close with this.
Here in Boston, structures, monuments, and markers permeate the city as reminders to its important role in the Revolutionary War. 5 victims of the Boston Massacre rest here at the Granary Burying Ground, only steps away from where they were shot. Near them lies Paul Revere, whose famous depiction of the incident fanned the flames of anti-British sentiment. Appraiser Wes Cowan joined me at the Old State House to discuss some lesser-known details of this revolutionary print. Wes, here we are at the Old State House in Boston, and it was right here where the Boston Massacre happened nearly 250 years ago.
That's right, Mark. This was a pivotal moment in the history of the American Revolution. It's March 5th, 1770. Dusk is falling. There's a British soldier named Hugh White standing on the steps to the custom house guarding the entryway. A Bostonian walks by, hurls an insult at this British soldier. Words are exchanged. Hugh White ultimately bludgeons one of the citizens with his rifle. A mob forms, snowballs are thrown, ice is being thrown, and eventually all hell breaks loose.
And shots were fired.
That's right. 5 Americans were killed, 6 were wounded.
That's what we've come to know as the Boston Massacre, and that event inspires this Paul Revere print entitled The Bloody Massacre.
Well, I wouldn't exactly call it Paul Revere's print.
Why wouldn't you call it Paul Revere's print?
Well, Revere copied this print from a fellow artist and engraver here in Boston named Henry Pelham. He made the drawing, showed it to Revere, and Revere then copied it before Pelham had time to bring it to press.
So you're saying Revere plagiarized this?
Well, that's pretty strong, but I'll guarantee you that's what Pelham would have said. Pelham was furious, and he actually wrote Revere a letter. We don't know that Revere ever got the letter, but the letter basically said, this is the most dishonorable thing that I can imagine somebody doing. You stole my advantage. I'd already paid for all the paper and engraving, and he basically called him a highway robber.
So do you think Revere did this to get the edge on Pelham?
One could argue that, but it's also important to remember that Revere was a patriot, and he was staunchly against British rule. It's a piece of propaganda. The print shows British soldiers firing indiscriminately into this crowd, and that's not exactly what happened. But Revere recognized that this would be a galvanizing image. He knew it was going to incite sentiments on the American side, but he also may have wanted to get the jump on Pelham because he knew he could maybe make a buck.
And did Pelham ever release a copy of his print?
He did, 2 weeks after Revere issued his. He titled his The Fruits of Arbitrary Power or The Bloody Massacre. And when you look at the two prints, you'll see that there's subtle differences, but they're very, very similar.
Well, how many did Pelham make?
Well, we don't know that. We do know one thing, that only 2 have survived.
And Paul Revere's print of the Boston Massacre, how many of those were made?
Well, about 200. And there are at least 25 known copies still existing.
When original copies of Revere's print come to market, what have they gone for?
One recently sold for just about $150,000, but that's not the record. About 10 years ago, one sold for more than $200,000. So 150 to north of $200,000.
Yeah.
The Pelham print is really rare, but it's probably not as desirable as Revere's print. If one were to come up at auction, I would expect it to have an estimate of at least $50,000 to $70,000. And this is a great example of one of those things where rarity does not necessarily equate with value.
Well, Wes, thanks so much for sharing all this information. Just fascinating.
That was great to see this print.
And that is that.
I am dead. Oh my God. So little respect now for this man.
Yeah, he definitely stretched the truth and stole the other guy's work all at the same time.
I don't even know words. What a schmuck.
Well, you know, I'm finding out all these things. John Hancock was a smuggler. Paul Revere was a crook. It really gives you, it's like all these things that I heard as a kid. It's like, oh yeah, you know, and it's like the good guys are the colonists and the bad guys. It's like,
I am definitely seeing this. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Well, I thank you so much, Todd, for switching with me. Also, the plumber is still here, but I have a feeling during the break I'll go down. I'll check in on him.
He's draining gunk out of your heater.
Yes, he's like, it'll be about 45 minutes. I was like, great, I'm gonna go back and learn about history. He's like, I can teach you how to do it yourself. thank you. I so love that you are willing to do that. And
Sure.
let's just agree that that's not what's going to happen right now. This has like hot water heater, pilot lights, all kinds of stuff. Let's go with you. Okay, so I said at the top of the hour that I had an announcement. I have a feeling it's going to get lost in this video, but I will say it now and put it in everybody's mind, and then I will discuss it on Discord and on Classroom and everything else, which is thank you to my mother, who sort of jokingly said, oh, I was writing a letter to my daughter, an email to Nora, and on the side of my email, an ad popped up for Hamilton, which is coming to Broadway. And so it was like, oh, get tickets to Hamilton. And I was like, I wonder if there's a production anywhere in driving distance to Stockdale High School, blah, blah, blah. And the answer was yes. And that they were closed for the holiday weekend. I was on the phone with them Tuesday morning when they opened. I went in this morning at 7:30 to go talk to administration, people, not Jack, but everybody else and anybody listening to the video. We have a new principal because Mr. Odlin has moved over to the district. Let's not call it up. Yes, in Costa Mesa. So I went and talked to them about how to coordinate buying the tickets and getting everybody down there. Right now, buses, the district won't even quote prices on buses because gas is so expensive. But there are the vans, the school vans. And there's a lot of things we have to do. They also last year, because of COVID, they weren't letting people go like on trips that were not competitions. But they're going to look into it, and I'm meeting with them again next week to discuss all of that. But we will make it work. We will make it work, and I'm really excited. So that's however it may work. I don't have any details here, but we will make sure that we go and see Hamilton live in Costa Mesa. That's the way it's going to go. So throwing that out there. She was so funny. The woman on the group saleswoman was like, I'm so sorry. Like they're blocking us from doing certain days. She's like, so it would have to be a weekday. And I was like, oh, miss a day of school for a field trip? I am so crushed. So that was okay. And then we'll figure it out. That's right. So on that note, I actually am glad that it's 4:55. I'll pause the recording and we'll take a 10-minute break. I'll go pay the plumber. And when I come back, I am very excited to work through parts of section 3 with you guys. I made notes all the way up to page 48, which I think is a great, if I can go 42 to 48, it's a great chunk and pretty cool. So let's pause. We'll see you back at 5:05 and I will go pay the plumber. Pause video. And resuming recording. Everybody likes when I now we're back. Excellent. So as you heard when last can't talk. Let's try that again. Hi everybody. Oh, here's Jack. That's perfect. Excellent. All right. So here's section 2 was all the battles, and you may have just heard Decker and I talking about how it's battle after battle after battle. So section 2, maybe a little harder not to slog through. It's an easy read, but to try to keep everybody separate is a little challenging. But section 3 comes along, and it's like the politics of the nation. Now, again, Decker and I have said this very clearly, that we would not have separated the battles from the politics, because that's, a crossover. But I think that it in terms of reading section 3, I've now read through all of section 3. I'm only going to lecture up through where it makes sense to stop, which is essentially through the Declaration of Independence. So that's what we're going to do today. Let me share my screen to here. I don't think I have any videos today, but I'll put that up there. And I will share this with everyone. Worry not. But here is the beginning of SOSI section 3. I always do it as a Google Doc, so I'll just keep adding to it, but I'll keep posting it every time I post a Zoom link, as we know. And section 3 is titled Creating a New Nation, the Political Revolution 1776 to 1800. So it's basically going to go through, talk about prescient. I don't know if you know that word. That means like really like relating to the day right now, like really kind of oddly coincidental and everything else. So 2019 to 2020, the academic topic was a history of medicine. And we hit the end of competition and states was canceled because of COVID. We had studied plagues and medical history, and then here we go. And then, we got into the water resources and first the Cold War, and we the art for that topic, really interesting. Like a lot of, I'll show you, I'll share the arts for a lot of like weird medical things. The next year was the Cold War, and that was right when Putin and Russia started really gearing everything up. So that was a little bit terrifying. Then we last year had water, and here we are in like this terrible, horrible drought and everything else. And here we are now talking about a political revolution. And if I tell you that section 3 finishes with, isn't it amazing that we have this peaceful transition of power between political parties, which is the election of 1800, and to have that sentence be as the January 6th insurrection trial is going on. And I mean, it's like, okay, academic, calm yourself. Yeah, it's wild. It is just wild, but we're not going to get there yet. But first, wait. Okay, so a quick recap, which is how the section starts out. So it's fall of 1774. There's the First Continental Congress. They're like, okay, we're going to meet again in May of 1775. To see if England doesn't get its, together. And England goes the opposite direction. They're like, hey, look, England, please stop taxing us without representation. Please stop billeting soldiers in our houses. Please stop, having these weird, like, kangaroo court trials and everything else. Just stop and treat us like normal citizens. And England is like, oh yeah, double down, beesies. And so England does not do its stuff. Shots fired in Boston, Massachusetts. That's the first hour of today. And Boston is under siege, right? Okay, so like this is what's going down when last we left our intrepid colonists like this. Okay, so now it's spring of 1775 and the Continental Congress gets back together. They make this decision. They're going to start trying to raise an army. They're going to start strategizing. They're going to send diplomats to France and Spain and the Netherlands to try to get money. They're doing all this stuff. They actually have no authority whatsoever, right? They are 13 completely independent city-state colony areas. They're like, that have been carved out of native lands. They really have no unified authority whatsoever. And the major issue with that is not that, you're welcome to get together. It's kind of like student government. You're welcome to say, I think that we should all like never have to dress out for PE, or I think that you should be able to just arrive in class whatever time we want. And that's fine. You can say all of that, but if you have no authority, good luck with that. And what gives people authority, honestly, is the ability to get money and raise money for things. Like if you have money talks, right? And Congress has no authority to get money from any of the states. So they're like, okay, everybody, this is what we're going to do. And they have no money. So they raise an army that they can't pay. And they send diplomats to Europe that they can't afford to send. They started issuing paper money, which when we get to econ, we're going to talk about that. Like literally, you can just print pieces of paper and be like, take this. It is worth $10. And someone can either be like, oh, okay, or they can be like, that is a piece of paper. If everybody pretends that piece of paper is actually $10, then great. Then you have a currency. but if you don't, I mean, and different states were putting out their own stuff and whatever it is. So they basically, the Congress gets together, it starts acting like a national government. It tries to get everybody on board. And it's like, okay, states, you got to pay for this war effort. Like, we're going to run a war and you got to pay your troops and you got to pay for supplies, and you got to do it. And some states were like, la, 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 I am not listening to you, which is really great when you're trying to, get together a war. And they create this Continental Army in June of 1775. So a year before we declare our independence from England, they create an army. And John and Samuel Adams nominate George Washington. And you remember, John is like the more successful and Samuel Adams is the less successful cousin. That's my favorite line from section 1. I don't know why I keep remembering that, but it's true. And they nominate George Washington instead of John Hancock, which I think is so funny now that I know a little bit about them. First of all, John Hancock is a smuggler. So like, okay, that's a thing. But the second thing is that sorry, there's somebody Facebooking me. But the second thing is that they nominate him for his military experience. So we all remember his military experience, which is when he's 21, he goes to the French forts and he's like, hey, could you leave? And the French are like, no. And the next year, he like sees some French guys out and he like shoots them and like basically starts the French and Indian War, the 7 years war that lasts 9 years. Like, he starts World War Zero. This is his military experience. He actually does well in the French and Indian War in terms of commanding. And then of course we've already, like, spoiler alert, we've already gone through section 2. So we know that he was actually an excellent military commander. So they may have been right. But part of why they were nominating him is because they wanted all 13 colonies on board. And remember, the northern colonies are kind of the rebel colonies, right? The New England colonies, like Boston, like Massachusetts, they're more of the rebel colonies. And the southern colonies, which, if you remember, in the French and Indian War, like, they're doing really well economically, being partners with England. They have many more enslaved people. So they're not so hot on the patriotic bandwagon here. So in a kind of what we call log rolling now, and this kind of like tit for tat exchange, the Adams cousins are like, hey, if we get this dude from Virginia, the southern states may get on board more than if we get this dude from Massachusetts, which is where John Hancock is from. And finally, they felt like George Washington really believed in the principles and the ideals of the American Revolution, which he seemed to really do, except for the part where he owned slaves. So that's a big thing, that he does not believe in equality for all. But they felt that they would not be jumping from the frying pan into the fire and essentially leaving the British monarchy and creating an American political tyrant. I think that was part of it. Again, they weren't really thinking independence so much. They were really thinking a battle for their rights to not be taxed and everything else. Okay. So they choose Washington. Washington leaves the Congress and goes off to go, help the troops and run the troops. And the Congress is still meeting and they're like, okay, let's just try to make peace. Like, yeah, we have an army getting ready, but really they're not really ready. Because remember, this is like, everybody and their cousin and like some gun they found in the barn and, whatever. Most of the delegates, 1775, most of the delegates are not pro-independence. We have not had the major issues of the war yet. This is 1775. So not only that, but these are guys, they're all guys, and they're all from states, and the states have sent them, right? There's like a Virginia state legislature and Maryland state legislature. And the state legislature was like, hey guys, why don't you go and see what everybody else is thinking? But they have not been authorized to vote for independence. Like, Maryland does not tell its delegates, hey, go vote for independence. It's more like fact-finding mission. Like, okay, go see what everybody's talking about. But nobody's like authorized to do anything yet. Only John Adams, who's like, dude, let's get him. So John Adams is like, yeah, independence, but everybody else is like, oh, let's try to play nice with England. We have a general Washington, but let's try to play nice with England. So they get this guy whose name is John Dickinson. And John Dickinson is the delegate from Pennsylvania. And he's like, look, Americans don't really want independence. We just want better trade, more equitable trade, better tax regulations. And he writes what's called the olive branch petition. So olive branches are what you extend metaphorically to, I'm sure it comes from ancient Greece or Rome or something, to be peaceful. So that he makes a petition to the British monarchy and the British Parliament that is like, look, let's all try. Can't we all get along with everybody? Let's not all fight, whatever. Thomas Jefferson writes the first draft. It is considered so inflammatory that they tear it up and try again. So now draft number 2 is this guy, John Dickinson, Ben Franklin, John Jay, John Rutledge, no clue. They all get together. They're all delegates from various places, and they all get together and they draft a second version, and they pledge loyalty to the crown. And they asserted their rights as British citizens. Like, you can't tax us without representation because we're British citizens. And 48 delegates sign copies. I told you they were not on board with the Declaration of Independence. They all signed the olive branch petition in 1775. It's going to take a year before they're like, oh, it's going down. So they send it to King George with 2 guys, a guy named Richard Penn, and we'll meet his brother in just a minute, who was the royal governor of Pennsylvania. So royal governor, he's appointed by the king. He's a British citizen. They send it with him and Arthur Lee, who's the Virginia delegate. And we're going to meet his brother in a second too. I think it's Arthur Lee that we meet the thing. So they take 2 delegates who are like both British citizens, and they send over this olive branch petition to get to the king. Then they try to explain themselves. So they write a document that is called the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. So look at the words. They're declaring the reasons and how necessary it is for them to essentially have been in these skirmishes. It's not yet a war, it's like skirmishes, but now they're arming their people, right? They're forming militias. So they're like, hey, we need to tell you why we're doing this. So Thomas Jefferson writes this declaration. He's there because Washington has left to go be in the army. I mean, to go lead the army. So now it's Jefferson is there as the representative. And so he's Jefferson, and this document basically is like, look, Parliament, here's what we're pissed about. Number 1, you tax us without representation. Number 2, you operate vice admiralty courts, which is like kind of fake, like we are not guaranteed justice with these courts. Number 3, remember the intolerable acts where you were like, you called them the coercion acts and we called them the intolerable acts. That we don't like that. Number 4, the declaratory act, which I had to go look up. So Britain is like the Stamp Act. That's the paper needs to be bought from us and stamped with our stamp on it. And when they repealed the Stamp Act, instead of just being like, oh, we're sorry, that was a bad act, they replaced it with the Declaratory Act, saying essentially like, yeah, okay, so we won't tax your stamp, but we could if we wanted to. We just, that's the thing, whatever. So those are our like grievances. And look, Parliament, says this document, look, we asked you to fix this and you haven't yet. We really don't want independence, says this document. We really don't want independence. We promise that we will lay down arms. We will stop fighting you as soon as you stop your hostilities, because you are the aggressors. That's what we're saying. That's what we're saying, they say. Yeah. The British basically not having any of it. Okay, so the Dickinson sends over the olive branch petition and is like, okay, look, we skirmished with you at Lexington and Concord, and kind of, yeah, you kind of won, but also we kind of won too. And look, we have this olive branch petition. We don't want to be independent and whatever. And Penn and Lee get to England and they deliver it. They can't go see the king directly. So they deliver it to the Earl of Dartmouth, who's the Secretary of State for the colonies, and for whom I'm sure Dartmouth College is connected. And the king had already made up his mind. He didn't even read the petition. So instead, he issues a proclamation of rebellion. He says the colonies are in open and avowed rebellion, which they were not yet, but he says they are. And he goes in front of Parliament in October, because everything takes longer back then. He goes in front of Parliament in October and said the colonies are at war. They're trying to establish an independent empire. Oh, that's great, Jack. Yeah, exactly, June. He gins up the war machine. He increases his naval forces, he increases his land forces, he tries to suppress the revolt and gain control of the colonies. So this is the political side of what we've already learned from, section 2, which is how things got out of hand at Lexington, at Concord, at the siege of Boston, and all this other stuff. Okay. So now we're like, hey, but we don't want to fight. Britain's like, that's war, beesies. And so now the colonists are like, oh crap, we got to get people motivated to fight back. So Thomas Paine writes a pamphlet called Common Sense. It's published anonymously, but we find out later that it is written by Thomas Paine, who was a patriot. He was a recent immigrant, though. So he has that sort of, English perspective. He's not somebody who was, born and his parents were born in the Americas. He is recently immigrated. He is an unsuccessful businessman right until Ben Franklin is like, hey, yo, come down to Philly and, I'll help you get set up. And then he writes this pamphlet. It is a pamphlet to me is like a small booklet. This booklet is 47 pages long. So I'm wimpy and weak and, whatever. But it basically is, hey, Americans, here's why we need to fight the British and maybe even get independence. So the first half, so the first 20 pages are literally like a scathing account of all the injustices that crazy King George III had done in Parliament. So they did this to us, and then they did this, and then whatever. And the second half was this sort of like, hey, do you know what we could do? Change the course of history by creating a new form of government that has never been seen before. So that's really persuasive, right? Here's all the wrongs done to us. And also we could go down in history for being this new nation that has this representational government. It was structured very much like a sermon. So remember, most of the colonists have at least come to the colonies to practice their Protestant religion. And so it used those Protestant beliefs, protest, right? That's how the Protestants get formed. They protest the Catholic Church to present a very distinct American identity. Nearly every patriot either read it for him or herself, or heard it for themselves, I should say, or heard it read out loud. Because remember, it's structured like a sermon, so it works well to be read out loud. And it was known as the most incendiary and popular pamphlet of the entire Revolutionary era, said a historian of that time. The most incendiary, meaning it ignited people's, metaphorically, their souls, their interests, their passion, their will to fight, and the most popular pamphlet of this era. Okay. So the public starts to be like, hey, yeah, have you heard Common Sense? Yeah, I think that's what we're doing, whatever. But again, Congress has no authority whatsoever to do any of this stuff. So a bunch of people get together who are very pro-independence. Remember, that's John Adams and his brother Samuel, or his cousin Samuel Adams, and Richard Henry Lee. The Lee is the guy who, the Arthur Lee is the guy who goes to England with the petition. The older brother, Richard Henry Lee, stays back and becomes part of this core of people who are in the Congress who are also agitating for rebellion. So he's part of the Virginia delegate, like his brother. So Congress is like, hey, it's 1775. Hey, delegates, go home, meet with your state legislature, they're not even states, right? Meet with your colonial legislatures and vote on whether we should declare independence. So we think there's a good reason to declare, not just try, we tried to be friends with England. England does not want to be our friend. They're not willing to stop taxing us and to stop doing all this stuff. We need your authority to actually do what they say we're doing and go into open rebellion. Okay, so Lee proposes, the older Lee, Richard Henry Lee, proposes a vote for independence. The whole Virginia delegate is like, okay, let's go do this. John Adams is like, second, I second the motion, right there, whatever. But they can't vote on it because Maryland, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New Jersey, and New York had not yet heard back from their legislatures, right? So they are like, okay, we'll wait 5 weeks and we'll see if this happens. So Richard Henry Lee, a delegate from Virginia, read this resolution before Congress, and it's quoted in the packet, that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. So this is the Lee resolution. And I have 1776 on this one. So it must be, let me make sure that I'm on the right thing. Oh, okay. So now it's fall and whatever. So now we're in spring of 1776. Okay. So Congress is feeling like, look, war is going to be inevitable between the Boston Massacre, Lexington Concord, Siege of Boston, the King's Proclamation. And it says in the packet that independence was inevitable. I think that's a misnomer. It's really just that war is going to be inevitable. If we win the war, we'll get our independence, but war is inevitable. So now it's 1776. The Lee resolution is out there, and they're like, okay, we have to literally essentially serve Great Britain. Like, Great Britain says we're in rebellion, but we've got to declare our independence. Like, they're saying we are, but we've got to declare our independence. So they gather these 5 dudes on the right-hand side. This picture is by John Trumbull. We've seen him. He's one of the people who made the thing that's on the back of the $2 bill. So John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, somebody named Roger Sherman, and somebody named Robert Livingston. Through 5 different delegations. You'll notice they're all from 5 different colonies. And so they basically want, again, this idea that Thomas Jefferson should, because he's a Virginian and people will like him, right? This is why we get George Washington to lead the armies over John Hancock, because he's from Virginia and it will unite everybody. And they do the same thing with the persuasive declaration. They got Thomas Jefferson, who's a Virginian, to write this because they think that the Southern states will vote for it if it's a Southern delegate writing it. So Thomas Jefferson composes the first draft, which probably helped by John Adams, because remember, John Adams is the one who's like, rah, rah, go independence, go. This is like June. They keep no minutes. They don't keep a record of who says what, because they want the process to be without scrutiny now. Like, they want to be able to say things that are controversial without being judged for it. So they don't keep minutes from it, which I thought it was really interesting. Okay. So they write this Declaration of Independence. And later, Thomas Jefferson fully admits that there really isn't anything particularly original about this declaration. The Constitution, on the other hand, will be more original, right? That's the whole common sense idea of like, hey, we're going to have a new government. And in fact, the compromises that were arrived at actually really do constitute a really kind of new way of governing that had not been seen for thousands of years, if ever. But the Declaration of Independence was just literally like, hey, yo, we don't want to be ruled by you anymore, which England had already said that was true. But so Jefferson is like, look, I just want this to be an expression of the American mind, and to be able to give that expression basically the proper tone of voice and spirit. So he gets his information from, and his wording and his structure from a couple of different sources. Number one is, remember, he's a Virginian, so Virginia has a constitution that makes it a colony, so he goes and uses some of that language. George Mason has drafted a Bill of Rights for Virginia in 17, so like this particular month, like all of that is being written for Virginia, so he cribs from that. And political theorist John Locke, who says essentially, that all men are created equal, and they should be enabled to have, and John Locke says, life, liberty, and property. And speaking of plagiarism, today is the plagiarism day of academic. Jefferson is like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? Not property, but the pursuit of happiness. And they wrap it all in the language and the structure of England's own Declaration of Rights. England in the 1600s had been ruled by a guy named King James II. The England of that time felt that he was an unjust king, and the will of the people was to overthrow their king, which doesn't usually happen with monarchies. And they had, in 1689, England itself had written this document. And so in 1776, the Americans cribbed from all of these different sources and then copied, plagiarized, melded from all those different sources, and synthesized, we say in fancy edu-speak. We synthesized all of those things and got them all together. All right. And in the meantime, of course, support is growing. So Connecticut, and I'm looking to see, I think I have a text, but I think it is just from Glenn and not from anybody else. Yep. No, good. The Connecticut, New Hampshire, Delaware, Pennsylvania, Maryland, New Jersey, everybody's getting on board. New York can't meet. Remember I said I didn't think it was a good idea to separate Section 2 from Section 3? Okay, so remember how New York is under siege and they're in Brooklyn Heights, and then they jump across to Kips Bay, and then the British take over the island of Manhattan, and the Americans keep running north, and they end up having a fight in Saratoga. Okay, all of that's going on. Britain is occupying New York City, so the New York legislation can't meet. Fun fact. By the end of June of this year of 1776, committee presents a draft of 5. Committee of 5 says to the Congress, hey, here's our draft. The next 2 days, they mostly just grammatically edit it, and because it's a Declaration of Independence, when in the course of human events, you'll see it in a second. But they did take out one major sort of controversial statement. Thomas Jefferson had put in that King George III had forced slavery onto the colonies, which, fun fact, is not true. I mean, the colonies have had slaves for, I can't even tell you, since that Columbus sailed over here just about. They took out that statement on the surface to make the document more appealing to South Carolina and to Georgia, both of whom had enormous amounts of enslaved people, absolutely, of course. But the northern colonies were also not so into this, oh, and yeah, you forced us to have slaves, because, fun fact, the North was in the merchant business, and slaves were huge business, right? That triangle that we've talked about in a lot of history classes. Bringing enslaved peoples to the Americas and to South America and Central America is big business. So the South has the enslaved populations working there. The North has fewer slaves, not none, but fewer slaves, but makes money from slaves. So everybody was like, let's just gloss over this part where we're blaming the king for having slaves over here. And I hope that this meme is not offensive. I should have crossed out the word minorities and just put people of color, but really, you have all these people that are, saying we think everybody should be, have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we have 500,000 enslaved persons here. I don't even know. Dickinson, who was the guy who wrote the Olive Branch resolution and was like, please, please, we should not be fighting for independence, was like, okay, look, let's just table this Lee resolution, which is their name for the Declaration of Independence. Let's just table it until at least we make connections with all our foreign alliances, like we get together with the foreign alliance people, and we write a constitution, which we're going to call the Articles of Confederation. Like we gotta have something in place. We can't just be like, we declare independence. We gotta have some stuff in place. So he gets up and says this. Thomas Jefferson is like, we need independence now. And the delegates vote for independence, 12 in favor and 1 abstention. And the packet doesn't say it, but it turns out the abstention is New York, which still hadn't managed to get its legislature not in a war zone. So that's why they abstained. They figured out the last of the wording, July 4th, 1776. It gets sent to the printer. July 4th, 1776, it gets sent to the printer. All right. John Adams, who's part of the delegates who votes for independence, writes to his wife, Abigail, and he says essentially like, boom, yeah, we need to celebrate. He thought it was July 2nd, but July 4th, like, I am apt to believe that this signing of the Declaration of Independence, that's what this it is. I am apt to believe that the signing of the Declaration of Independence will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parades, with shows and games and sports and guns and bells and bonfires and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore. And look at us doing all of that stuff with shows and games and sports and guns and bells and bonfires and illuminations. We do that. Okay, so we're going to wrap up today with a focus on actually what is the Declaration of Independence. And it's kind of neat that we're doing this the week of July 4th. So here we go. The Declaration of Independence, it is one broadsheet. That's one front page of a sheet. And actually the New York Times prints it every year. But it's kind of hard to read. But it is on one scroll, one sheet of paper, this big. And it was sent out to get printed at the end of this. And it is broken into 5 sections. The introduction, the preamble, the indictment of King George III, the denunciation of British people, and a conclusion. So I'm going to go through each one of these parts, and this is how we're going to do this. And this is exactly what it looks like in Congress, July 4th, 1776, a declaration by the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress assembled. So that's the title. That's the heading of it. Here's what we're saying. It's a declaration by the Congress of all the representatives of the United States. And so section 1 is the introduction. The introduction reads, or let me talk about it first, and then I'll read it, and then we'll go back to it. Okay, so it says, look, there's something called natural law. And natural law, it's one of those glossary terms. It is where you have an unchanging sort of way of living, an ethic, a human ethic that is unchanging and governs all moral principles, and it underlies all human conduct. It doesn't say what natural laws are, but it's this idea. It's variations of essentially the 10 commandments, right? Like, as a society, we shouldn't kill each other. As a society, we should respect each other's boundaries. As a society, we should, be able to negotiate issues and problems and everything else without hurting other people and everything else. This is the idea of natural law. And it basically, the introduction says, look, natural law, the way that societies work in general, means that if people are not being treated according to the rules of natural law, they should be able to break free from that society. The trick is it has to be for good reason. It has to be for good reason. So basically the introduction is like, look, if we have good reason that's reasonable and that we can explain, then we should have the ability to break free and be independent. So the introduction is written to give a purpose to this document, to clearly and publicly announce why America wants to no longer be a British colony, why we want our independence. And so the introduction says, when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So let's break that down just a little bit. When in the course of human events, that means when things that are happening among people, and for the Americans, it was like, you know, the siege of Boston and the Boston Massacre, and you know, the unfair taxation and everything else. When history is happening, and in the course of human events, it becomes necessary to separate, to dissolve the bonds that connect them with another government, and to assume that they have reason to live according to the laws of nature, that they are entitled, nature and nature's God. Notice it doesn't say God, it says nature's God, nature and nature's God, the laws of nature. In other words, these guys were not like, you know, promoting a particular religion. They're like, look, we deserve the right to, you know, tell you what we need and whatever, but we have to declare the causes of what's making us do this. So that's the introduction. This is why we want to break free. That's the whole introduction. So the second part is the preamble. The packet calls it the two most famous sentences ever written in the English language. And it basically outlines not the way that the government's going to run. That's going to be the Articles of Confederation, which is going to morph into the Constitution. But this is literally a sort of statement of philosophy, like a motto for the governing the Americas, that it basically like, look, revolution is going to be justified if we don't get what natural law is supposed to give us. And it discusses the phrase that all men are created equal. All men are created equal. And they literally mean English men only are created equal. And you have to own property. So like women, enslaved people, ain't none of those people. Not you know, those are not the same people. All right, let me see if that's, oh, the plumber. Okay, I'm gone. Hot water, 35 to 45 minutes. Okay, I'll still have to replace the thing. All right, good to know. And so here is the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. It is the two most famous sentences in American history, apparently, written in the English language. Sorry, so that's a little bit hyperbolic, but okay. We hold these truths to be self-evident. They're so truthful that they are just obvious. That all men are created equal, unless you're a woman or a person of color, but okay. That all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator, given by their creator, whoever that may be, certain unalienable rights. You can't argue with these rights. And among these rights, not all the rights, but among these rights that we have, yes, it's only two sentences, are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All people, Englishmen, have the right to live a life. They have right to freedom, to liberty, and they can pursue happiness, whatever that means to them, which is, again, not Locke property. That to secure these rights, in order to get these rights, governments have to be instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That the people have to create a government, and the right by the people, for the people, that they have, the government has to be created by the people and held accountable to the people. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, like Britain's, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. So we can get rid of any government that doesn't respect our rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to effect their safety and happiness. So you gotta let us do this. This is the preamble. We have noticed that we have the right to break free of England's rule because it does not give us safety and happiness anymore. There you go. Okay. Oh, it went backwards. All right. So the third section lists the grievances against George III. So they're like, okay, so you didn't do this for us. We want a government that does this, and here's what you did wrong. So the third section, it establishes a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, which is taking someone's property or power or will by force. So it's like you hurt us again and again, you hurt me again and again, and you took my rights away. And it resulted in an absolute tyranny. You're a tyrannical government and we don't have to listen to you anymore. And it accuses King George and the parliament of committing 27 grievances. And most people would organize them chronologically, like first you did this and then this happened and then this happened or whatever. But it doesn't do it that way. It basically, it chunks it into 3 groups. So the first group of grievances, numbers 1 through 12, are basically you've abused your power, you've suspended colonial laws, you've dissolved our legislatures, and you've maintained a standing army during peacetime. So the packet itself doesn't get into the specifics of like, this is what charge number 3 says or anything like that. But 1 through 12 are like, look, you abused your power in these ways, right? All of the following except. Charges 13 to 22, the next set of grievances are, it's not only you, King George, you colluded with Parliament, which you shouldn't do because Parliament should represent us, but you got together with Parliament and you passed unconstitutional laws, like you taxed us without representation, you changed our charters, which meant our governing systems, you just changed them without our input, you suspended our trade, right? You caused, like the tea boycotts and stuff the tea taxations and, what we could and couldn't sell, the Stamp Act where we had to use your paper, all that stuff. And you limited our right to trial by jury. That Parliament passed all these things too, and they're complicit in it. So we can't just protest the monarchy, we're protesting Parliament as well. And the last bunch of charges are basically like, and you started a war with us. You are violent and you are cruel and you wage war against the American subjects. So that's the third of the 5 chunks of the Declaration of Independence. Okay. The fourth part of the Declaration of Independence is called the denunciation, which is like where you put somebody down. It's like the flame war. So it basically is like, look, here's why we have to declare independence. And the packet has, I think, typo is not the right word. Like, I think somebody didn't proofread this email number 573. The packet says that Jefferson argues that a severing of the relationship between the colonies and America is justified and necessary. And I feel like it should say the colonies and Great Britain is justified and necessary. And I went and looked at the errata sheet and they don't say anything. So I want to be like, excuse me, hi. The colonies of America are the same thing. So we're not severing that. Yeah. Just saying. So I'm going to write to them because that just feels like a little problem issue there, whatever. And so that's section 4, the denunciation, like this is it, this is the wrap up, and the conclusion. We need to dissolve our ties with the British Empire and gain our political freedom. So those are the 5 sections of the Declaration of Independence. I never knew this. It is signed. I knew that it was signed what I thought was sort of willy-nilly kind of all over the place, and the joke that John Hancock signed his name really big because he wanted King George to be able to see it. But it turns out that they signed it basically in groups of states, which I just never knew. And I only found this because I Googled like signatures because it said they signed it. So here's all like the Pennsylvania people and New York people and whatever. Here's the rest of the Massachusetts people. Here's John Adams and look at Payne and whatever. And then here's John Hancock also. If you see the John Hancock is now the name of like a banking institution, and that's their logo, is his signature. And the packet says, this is a quote from the packet, in affixing their signatures to the document, the 56 signers pledged to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor to the cause of independence. So they sign this stuff. Philadelphia printer John Dunlap produces 200 copies of the broadside, like 200 copies. He works through the night, printing. It's published in newspapers. It's read out loud in town centers and in churches. So there's no separation of church and state at this point. One of the first formal read-alouds was on July 8th in the yard of Philadelphia's Independence Hall. Washington had it read out loud to his troops in New York City on July 9th, while the British ships were raiding in the harbor, because he wanted to motivate his troops. And the British, who obviously because loyalists are right there. So like the British get copies of this too. It's not like it's a secret American document. The British send copies to London. Parliament doesn't officially answer it, although remember the king has sort of preempted this by declaring war already and saying that we're an open rebellion. Parliament doesn't officially answer it, but the prime minister, whose name is Frederick, Lord North, commissions a pamphleteer, which is a fantastic word that I think I should be, to publish a rebuttal to this. And loyalists in New York actually literally sign a declaration of dependence because they're like, we don't want to rebel. We don't want to rebel. So they sign that. And the Americans, though, they get pretty fired up. In fact, after the hearing of the reading of the Declaration of Independence on July 9th, they tear down a statue of King George III, and they melt the lead from the statue into musket balls, which they use to fire on the British troops. So there you have it, right there. And that is it. I'm going to put right here before I post, I think I'm going to put, I looked for a reading of the Declaration of Independence. Can you see this right here? Can you see this video here on here? I hope so, maybe. I looked for a reading of the entire Declaration of Independence, and I kept finding ones that were not great, but now that we've talked about it, I think I'm going to include this video onto my slideshows, just because I think that it's worth having access to the entire Declaration of Independence, read out loud. You don't have to know it, but I think it is, kind of a neat thing to have access to. So I'll put that there. It is not a very long video, a 13-minute video, again, as something that you might be interested in. Hi, Audrey. And so that is where we're going to pause for today. The next section that we'll take up when we meet next week, Monday and Wednesday, is we're going to actually talk about the Articles of Confederation, which, if you remember, Dickinson is like, we need to have this in place before we declare independence. And America's like, ready, fire, aim. So we ignored him. But so we're going to talk a little bit about, how we're governing now, and putting that together and the compromises that came up with that, because it really was revolution. That part was really actually revolutionary. And then that'll probably be next week, and then we'll wrap it up with essentially, some challenges that came up here. So long story short, that is the end of today. I am going to stop the recording and stick around if you have questions. Otherwise, I hope you have a wonderful week. Do remember that I have offered, I have offered a study system, a chart that you can fill in for section 2 with all the battles while that stuff is still more fresh in your mind. It's available on the Google Classroom. And so I have that as due on Sunday night. I think there are benefits and drawbacks to doing that now as opposed to in a few months when you're trying to really memorize it, but we'll see. So let me stop the recording. Boom. Yes,